On the third new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wild wilderness of Sinai. They set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain, while Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel." Going to verse 16 in the same chapter. "On the morning of the third day there was thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. Now Exodus chapter 20 begins as this, "And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." This is the word of the Lord. Now, why did I skip around? What's going on here? The thunders come. This is the most important. If you've been asleep in the series for the last couple months, this is the time to wake up. Because the thunder comes. The thunder! I know, that scares people. I scared some of the kids in the back, I'm sure. But that's what's coming. See, the whole summer we've been looking at this book of Exodus saying, what does it mean to be on an Exodus? And what does it mean? How's God going to do anything with you in the Exodus? What is he doing, if anything at all? What is God doing with you on your Exodus, your own spiritual journey, wherever you are in your life at this moment? And what you've seen with the way he works with his people throughout the book of Exodus is that at every turn, at every bend, it's grace upon grace and mercy upon mercy. And he's working on them. They've been in the wilderness for a while now. But now they're at Mount Sinai. This is when he comes down as thunder. And he has to come down as thunder. Why? Because he's about to give them the law. He's about to give them the 10 Commandments. I didn't read that in chapter 20. We'll get to that in a couple weeks. Here's where he's about to say, here's my law. Here's what it means to obey me. Here's what I want you to do with your life, he would say. But before the law comes, the thunder comes. Because God's got one important thing, one critical thing to tell the people before he gives them the law. What you're going to see today is that he doesn't just come down and give them a rule book. He doesn't just come down and say, obey me, do this, do that, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. He prefaces it. See, what he's doing here on the mountain when he comes down, and what you'll see today, is that he's basically saying, before I give you my law, I want you to know why I'm giving you my law. I want you to know what it's going to do for you. Why, the question you would ask is, why obey this God? And he says, listen, people. Before I give you my 10 Commandments and all the other subsequent law that he's going to give them, he says, before I do that, you've got to know why I'm doing it. Otherwise, none of it will ever matter. It'll just be simple blind obedience, God says in this passage. And he gives us two main reasons of to why he's going to give the law. Why should you obey him? If you're asking that point at the point in your life where you say, I have obeyed, but now I'm wondering why I should obey. I'm glad you asked. I want to give you the why today, because that's what he does here. Before the law, before the what of the law comes the why. Here's what it's not first. There's one thing that the law is not meant to do, and there's two things that it is meant to do. First, if you look at verse 5, the law, before he comes back with the law, he says, don't you see what I've done for you? He has this interesting expression. He says, I've borne you on eagle's wings. What God is saying is, listen, people, tap the brakes. Before you get the law, know this. The law is not meant to save you. He looks at these people and he says, think about an eagle. The eagle carries, he says, I carried you out already. I saved you. You didn't do it. All you did was walk across the river, the sea that I parted. He says, listen, first and foremost, know this, my law, obeying me, it's not meant to earn my love. And I say that, and I repeat it, and I'm hoping that because you're here at Seoul Grace Community this morning, you know that we believe in grace. He says it's purely by grace that you're saved. He says, listen, first and foremost, you must know the law is not meant to get you anything. And we can say that in our heads, and I know that most of you, and I talk to, I know almost all of you, and I talk to you regularly, and if I haven't, I will, but I know most of you intuitively know that. You know that obeying God won't get you anything. It's not a point system. It's not a merit system. That obeying God doesn't earn his love and favor. He's already given that to you. He says, I already borne you out on eagle's wings. He says, what he's saying is this. It's not performance and then acceptance. It's acceptance and then obedience. He says, if you don't understand that, if you don't get that right, you're always going to be performing in order to be accepted. Let me push this out a little further. I know most of you think that and know that in your head, but here's the problem with the human condition. We're wired to go the exact opposite way. We're wired to tell ourselves we perform, then we're accepted. We achieve, then we're loved. That's the way our jobs are structured. I joked last week about my performance review. Of course, everybody gets reviewed. Perform, then you're accepted. Perform, then you're promoted. That's the way our work's wired. That's the way our relationships are wired. Why? It's because that's the way our hearts are wired. And God comes down to them, and the very first thing he says is, remember what I did for you. It wasn't what you did. It's not your performance that gets my acceptance. It's my acceptance that then breeds your obedience. He says you have to get the paradigm right. This is why, and I read from chapter 20. Chapter 20 is when he gets in the Ten Commandments, but you know what he does first? Remember, go back and look at your Bible. He says, before he gives the Ten Commandments, he says this, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Why would he do that? Why not just come down and give him the rules? Why not just come down and say, do this, don't do that. I'll smack you on the head. Be this way, be religious, be good, be moral. First thing he does is he gives them a history lesson. Before the Ten Commandments come, before the law comes, he says, if you want to know my law, you're going to have to remember my love first. You're going to have to go through the process of retuning your heart to say that it's not performance and then acceptance. It's acceptance and then obedience. It's got to flow that way before you start with anything. What is he doing here? Well, he's forming his community. That's what they did when you started city. This was the time in Mesopotamia when cities were starting to be formed. Oftentimes you form it around a high place for military reasons, a temple. Here they were forming it around a mountain. You know what he's doing? God's building his city. He's forming his community. Do you see this now? And he says, the first thing you guys got to know, if you want to be my people, you have to remember my love first. Go back. Recount the times that I carried you on eagle's wings. Out of slavery into freedom. See, he says the law is not meant to achieve anything. He says you don't achieve my love through your performance. And that while we may say it in our heads, we don't live it in our hearts. Fundamentally, even in our relationships, this is the way we work. You perform for me and I'll accept you. You fail me, I cut you off. You hurt me, you're gone. And God says, in my world, in my community, it's the exact opposite. He says, remember, people, first, how you were accepted. By grace alone did you get out of Egypt. Now, he says, let's talk about obedience. Do you see what this starts to do? What it should start to do for you? It should start to reframe your paradigm about obeying God. See, obedience becomes sweet when you start with acceptance. When you can first start to say, I know he carried me out. How sweet that is. Now, let me obey. What do I need to obey, God? See, it reshapes the paradigm. It reshapes your whole mindset of why you read your Bible, why you come to church, why you pray. It's an outflowing of the acceptance. It's an acknowledgement that he took you on eagle's wings and he carried you out of slavery. Okay, so if that's what the law is not, what is the law meant to do? And he tells us here in verses 4 and 5. He says, listen, therefore. He says, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant. I'll get to the covenant in part. That's the cool part. But he says, if you obey my voice, meaning if you obey me, if you follow what I'm about to tell you in these 10 commandments and subsequently after that, if you do those things, he says, this is what's going to happen. And there's two things. He says, you're going to be my treasured possession, and you're going to be a holy nation. And I know if you came this morning, I oftentimes say that my sermons, I try to make them medicative, meaning people come to church with a problem and they say, Pastor, preach a sermon that's going to help me with my problem. This isn't going to be one of those today, really. What this is going to be is it's not going to probably fix any of your problems just yet today. But it's going to be something that you and I need to reflect on for this particular community, your heart. God is forming a community here, and he says, this is what I want you to be. And before you obey my law, or I even tell you what it is, you have to know why. And it's meant, he says, it's meant to make you a treasured possession. And it's meant to make you a holy nation. What do I mean by this? Look, verse 5. He says, your treasured possession. And actually, this word in Hebrew is a really, really cool word. It refers to the specific possession that a king would have, sort of their personal possession. See, kings at the time had possessions, they had treasures. And strategically, you would spread them out. You don't keep them in one place because if somebody attacks you, they take all the treasure away. So you don't do that. You spread them out. And that's why they have storehouses, and they're spread out geographically and strategically located. But this type of treasure, what he says here, this word is unique. Because it means the treasure that the king would have in his bedroom. It means the treasure that the king would dote on. It means the treasure that the king would hold every night. You see what God is saying to you and his people in Exodus? He's saying, I want you to obey me. Why? Because I want you to realize that you're my treasured possession. You're the thing I dote on. You're the thing I want to hold and admire and pour my life over. You're my treasured possession, he says. He's falling in love. This is intimate language. This is the most intimate. This is the treasure the king probably would have had in his bed at night if they slept with their treasure. That's kind of weird. But you get what I'm saying here. But let me put it this way. What is this? Where am I going with this whole, he treasures me, okay, therefore what? You know when you start to fall in love? And if you haven't, sorry for you, you'll figure this out when you do fall in love. When you start to fall in love, you start to look at the other person, and you start to try to find out what makes them happy. And you want to go do those things. You ask, the person, do you like chocolate ice cream or vanilla ice cream? And the person, it says, I like chocolate. I don't like ice cream. But I like pizza, I'm sure. And my wife tried to find that out probably when we fall in love. See, when you start to fall in love, when you start to treasure someone, you say, do you like chocolate or vanilla? Why? Because I just want to get you what you want. It's my life. It's my daily ambition to get you either chocolate ice cream or vanilla ice cream. Why? Because you're treasuring the person. You're doting on them. Now, God says, before I give you my law, I want to ask you something, God says. Chocolate or vanilla? I'll get it for you. That's all I long to do, he says, because you are my treasure. You're the thing I hold. You're the thing I value. You're the thing I dote on. In my most intimate moments, God says, now, you see what this starts to make you look at the law a little bit differently. To the extent that you know he treasures you this much, then you start to treasure him. And you go to God and God, do you want chocolate ice cream or vanilla? What do you want? I just want to give it to you. See, now, hopefully you're starting to see that the law is not just a rule book. It's not a point system to get you the merit and the favor of God. God says, that's not why I'm going to give you this law. I'm going to give it to you because I want you to know how special you are to me. I want you to know how much I treasure you. How I can't stop thinking about you. It means passion versus obligation. It means love rather than drudgery in obedience. The law, he says, is meant to make you know how utterly treasured you are. Start to reflect on that you are his treasured possession, the thing he looks at before he goes to sleep at night, the thing he stares at when he first wakes up in the morning. And I guarantee you, your heart will start to melt. It'll start to change. You'll start to say, what can I do for this God then? It'll start. But he says, that's not all I want out of you. I want you to know that my law, you are my treasure, but, and it's even better than that, he says, I want you to know that you are a holy nation, that you're a kingdom of priests, he says. What does this mean? Well, the word holy, it just means distinct, different. God says, know that how much I treasure you, yes. Know how I've liberated you and taken you down on his wings. I've already saved you. But he says, now I want you to be distinct. That's what the Ten Commandments, that's what the entire law is meant to do. It's meant to take these people and separate them out so that people look at them a little bit differently. So the laws that he gives them are actually radical at the time. They're profound. But the reason why he says is, I want you to be different. I want you to be distinct. The rest of the world operates under a certain value system of priorities. And he says, when I give you my law, all your priorities are going to change. Your whole value system should be flipped on its head. The way we use our money, the way we use our authority, our power, the way we look at gender, the way we look at marriage and relationships, all of it's changed. The world says go this way, and God says, now I'm going to have you go a different way. You're going to be holy, he says, by my law. You're going to be distinct, he says, by my law. Listen, I've said this many times. It bears repeating. It's here at Soul Grace Community. We're a small community, which is great. And it would make me feel, my ego would go off the charts if you guys brought all your friends next week and we filled up all these rafters, okay? I really would, I'll be honest. My ego would go out crazy. I'd love it. Bring all your friends if you want. But I've said this many times. That's not really what I care about for this community. Because that's not really what God's saying here. What I would care about is that here's the thing, if you have a coworker, if you have a friend, and they look at you and they say, I don't believe what you believe, and I'm never going to go to your church, but I'm really glad that you're here because you're doing something different in the world. That would be my vision. Now, invite people to church. Please, just keep inviting them to church. I love it. Don't worry about my ego. I'll take care of that on my own. Invite to church. But I'll be honest with you, I don't care. And you shouldn't either. What you should care about is that if somebody looks at you in the city here, one of your coworkers, one of your fellow students, anybody, and they say, I don't believe what you believe, but I don't want you to go anywhere because you're doing something different in the world. Your values are different. The way you use your money is different. The way you use authority and power is very different than anybody else, and it's radical and it's beautiful, and I like it. Stay around. That's what he's saying when he says, I want you to be a holy nation. Did you know that this was one of the first cultures where daughters could inherit wealth? Holy, distinct. This was one of the first cultures where adultery was not just a sin according to a woman, but now for a man as well. This is one of the first cultures where somebody says, I want you to give a certain percentage of your wealth to the poor. Radically different. Radically countercultural, he says. He says, here's my law, but know this, it's meant to make you know that you're treasured. It's meant to make you holy. And a kingdom of priests, what he means by that is this. What does a priest do? A priest mediates between God and the people. And he says, that's what I want you to be. A city set on a hill. I want people to look at you, and Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, and see a city on a hill. Why? So they praise me, he says, God says. People should look at our lives and say, I don't know what's going on there, but it's different, and it's radical. They give away their money. They take time to help others. That's not how I was raised, people would say. And he says, that's what I need from you. That's what my law is meant to do. Make you know you're treasured. Make you know that you're distinct. Your values will change. You see now what the law is meant to do. You thought the Ten Commandments are just rules to follow. He says, there's so much more. They're a written contract of my love for you. They're a covenant between me and you, he says. That's why you should obey. Now, last week I said this. If you get to this point in the sermon, you should be thinking, okay, so what? Who cares? You tell me that if I obey him, that he'll make me I'll be his treasured possession. And you tell me, you say, Pastor, you said, if I obey him and his law, then I'm going to be distinct and different, and my heart's going to start changing. I'm going to be a more generous person. I'm going to be a more loving and giving person, a more sacrificial person. And you say, but how do I know? How do you know? How can you be sure that the God of the universe truly thinks you're a treasured possession? How can you be sure that the God of the universe looks at you and me, and says, you are mine. I want you. You and you alone. I want you, and I want all of you to come together in community. How do you know that? Well, I told you the word that I'd get to later. I'll get to it now. You know it by the covenant. You know it by the covenant that he makes with his people. See, I cheated you a little bit. Don't you love when pastors do this? They bring up another verse that they didn't read from before. But if you skip ahead, we will get to it later on. Skip ahead to chapter 24. After he gives them the law, something rather interesting happens. Something unique happens. See, he gives them all the law. He gives them all the do's and the don'ts. And the people, as stupid as they are, stand up, and in one voice it says, you can see this in chapter 24, say, we will follow everything you told us. I mean, they should have hedged their bets, right? They could have said, we'll follow most of what you told us. We will try our hardest to follow as much as possible of what you said. No, they stand up, and they have the gumption to say, all that you just told us in the law, we'll do it all, God. And God does something rather interesting to them, rather unique. Moses takes a blood of an animal, and he sprays it on the people. And now you're thinking, that's kind of gross. What's the purpose of that? And blood sprinkling on us doesn't really mean much, except it sounds really gross. What's he doing? What's Moses doing? Moses is finalizing the covenant. See here, put this in logical order. God comes down and says, here's why I want you to obey my law. Then in the Ten Commandments he says, here is my law, so follow it. The people stand up and make the most foolish promise of all, knowing that they can never fulfill it, saying, we'll obey everything. And they don't, and they haven't, and they fail. And Moses sprinkles blood on them, and you know what he's saying? This was the way in which in this time that you made covenants with each other. You sprinkle blood on them, or sometimes you cut an animal in half. We saw that in Abraham in the book of Genesis. And you walk between the animals, or you sprinkled the blood on them or me. And it's a way to say this: if you fail, then it's your blood. See what Moses is doing? He's looking at the people and saying, if you don't live up to your end of the bargain, it's your blood. It's on you. You fail, you pay. But they never pay. He sprinkles the blood on them. And then the very next verses, they go up to the mountain and they eat with God. It was they ate, and it was so glorious that underneath they just saw the feet. Underneath the feet was something like sapphire. This is one of the craziest ways to make a covenant. What God is saying is, here's my law. And if you fail it, it should be on you. You should have to pay. But you won't. He makes the promise with them. But he says, it's not your blood. You fail. I pay, he says. And it doesn't make much sense until you get to the New Testament. Where is Pastor going with all this talk about blood and covenants? And this doesn't make any sense. Here, I have an easier job today because in the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, the guy who wrote Hebrews wrote a sermon about this passage. So it makes my job easy. All I got to do is read what he wrote. And if it didn't make any sense to you, here's what he's saying. And here's how he's going to connect the sprinkling of blood by Moses as a way to say, you fail, you don't pay, I do. Here's what the writer of Hebrews says. Hebrews 12, starting in verse 18, here's the explanation. He says, for you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest, and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. He's talking about the mountain. He's saying they went to God in fear. You go to God now in love. And he finishes by saying this. He says in verse 20, for they could not endure the order that was given, saying, even if a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. He says, you have not come to Mount Sinai, but you have come to Mount Zion, and the city of the living God, and the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, our mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. See what the writer of Hebrews is saying? All this blood splattering stuff, it won't make any sense for you. You'll never want to obey his law. You'll always go to God in fear and trembling, or you'll run away from him in fear and trembling. He says, they went to the mountain that shook with thunder. He says, you go to a new mountain. And there's a reason why Jesus stood up at the Last Supper. And he says, this is my blood. This is a new covenant given for you. Brothers and sisters, this morning, you'll never want to obey God unless you know that you can trust him. You'll never want to do anything he wants you to do in your life unless you know how treasured and how valuable you are to him. And the way, if you want to know, if you ask me this morning, Pastor, how do I know that I'm a treasured possession? How do I know that I'm distinct and holy? How do I know? I can't give you anything else but that. That it was Jesus' blood that was sprinkled for you. So that when you fail, this is the only God that says you don't have to pay. He already did. You don't pay. The blood doesn't come on you. It has every right to come on you. That's what the people, they all stood up and said, we will do everything. And Moses sprinkles the blood and says, okay, good, it's on you. But God says, no. It's on my son. It's on Jesus. You'll never be a holy nation. You'll never be a kingdom of priests. You'll never want to do anything that this God wants you to do in your life unless you know how infinitely valuable you are to him. Jesus at the Last Supper says, it's my blood that will get sprinkled for you. You don't deserve it. And you've probably broken every rule that I gave you anyway. All the mistakes of your life, all the wrongs that you've done, every time you stepped over your own feet and fallen down, I blow you on eagle's wings. And if you say, what's the proof of it? I don't have a good C.S. Lewis quote for you like I normally do. I don't have a movie illustration to give you. I don't have something to quote from a book. All I can give you this morning is Jesus. But that's all you need. His blood, sprinkled for you. Then you know. That's the only way you know. You'll never trust and obey because there's no other way, as the old children's song says. You'll never trust and obey until you first trust in the one who says, I sprinkle my son's blood out for you. Don't you see what I've given up? God says. Now, do you feel treasured? You should. And if you don't, go to him now in prayer. Ask him to remind you how treasured of a possession you are. And then he proved it at the cost of his son's blood given for you. Pray to him now in that prayer.